The 1950s through 1970s Presidents and Movements. Part 2. In the last video, we discussed Truman, Eisenhower, JFK, Lyndon B. Johnson, and the Nixon administration and their policies. Nixon was forced to resign due to the Watergate scandal. His vice president was Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford only became president because the initial vice president, Spiro Agnew, was also forced to resign earlier because of tax evasion. So Gerald Ford, as a Republican, had a lot of knocks going against him, and people were looking for a change. Jimmy Carter packaged himself as a man of the people, a common man, a peanut farmer, and his newness appealed to the country. Although it was a close election, Jimmy Carter became president. Carter was more known for his foreign policy. He created a treaty and got it approved for the control of the Panama Canal. We had control of the Panama Canal all the way through 1999. He also singled out USSR, the Soviet Union, formerly known as Russia, as a violator of human rights. When we think about today's crisis, America has seen action in Afghanistan and Iraq. This fighting actually goes back into the 1970s. Russia invaded Afghanistan, and as a supporter of democracy and of course against communism in the height of the Cold War, we actually go in to help Afghanistan, not with troops but with money. The U.S. also refuses to sell grain to the Soviet Union, something that was needed. So it was sort of an embargo to them to try to get them to do the right thing. In the process, we also boycotted the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow. I actually remember a lot of the Olympians feeling so sad. They all received gold medals, all of those who actually made it to be Olympic athletes from America, but it was a little shallow. And of course, when we had our Olympics here in California in 1984, the Soviet Union boycotted those events as well. The détente, or the cooling down of the Cold War tensions created by Nixon, had collapsed. Carter is also known for the Camp David Accords. Camp David is the private vacation home of the president. And so at Camp David, he actually created a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. If you recall, when Israel became a state, a lot of the countries surrounding Israel did not like it, and they attacked Israel several times. Israel went to war with Egypt on a couple of occasions, so he was trying to negotiate peace. For his efforts for having the first step to achieving peace in the Middle East, something we still try to do today, Carter won the Nobel Peace Prize. He is still actively engaged in trying to create peace in the Middle East, even though he's no longer president. The fall of Iran. Today, President Obama is trying to negotiate peace treaties with Iran. Because in the 1970s, the late 70s, there was the fall of the Shah. The leader, named the Shah, was actually pro-American, and many Iranians did not like that. They want to be fundamentalists. They want to keep Iran for Iran and not have it so Western. It's a Muslim country, and they wanted to make sure that the Muslim heritage and the Quran was actually being followed. So he was forced to leave, and they're militarized dictatorship, just like many other nations that happened. They disliked America. We actually had hostages taken in our American embassy, 52 to be exact. Ross Perot's daughter, a former presidential candidate back in 1992, daughter was actually one of those hostages. Americans were held hostage in Iran for over a year, 444 days to be exact. Carter, his inability to get the Americans released quickly, loses the election as a result. The other thing that Carter did that really made Americans mad is that he actually granted a pardon to all those soldiers, or I should say those who did not become soldiers. The sorry, excuse me, class, the draft dodgers, those who escaped to Canada because they did not want to fight in the Vietnam War. In America, although they did not like the Vietnam War, they did not like people who displayed disloyalty to their country. So that was also another dislike for Carter, and he lost the election to Reagan in 1980. In fact, he only won one state, Georgia. We discuss civil rights throughout our course in U.S. history. The 13th Amendment, of course, abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment grants citizenship, including African Americans, to anyone who's born in this country or born to American parents. But more importantly, it also said that we have equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment, if you recall, grants the right to vote to males. Women were not allowed to vote. But of course, when that law was passed, very quickly Jim Crow era came in. We had poll taxes, literacy tests, the grandfather clause to make sure that poor whites were allowed to vote as well. So the gains that we made during Reconstruction were quickly smashed with Plessy versus Ferguson, when it basically said that separate equal is going to be allowed. And this picture shows a color entrance. And that happened right here at Belk's, that when it used to be downtown. There was an interest for African Americans and there was an interest for whites. In fact, you couldn't even try on your clothes in the stores. You had to take them home. You had to buy them, take them home, and be done with it. So it was very important that you knew that clothes could fit during this era. But Americans fought back. MLK, of course, was a major leader of the civil rights movement, and he followed and practiced nonviolence like Gandhi did in India. He wanted to show that racism was evil and that it was intolerant. And so by being nonviolent and peaceful, he actually gained the sympathy and empathy of many Americans. He was only asking for what our founding fathers said that we had: equal rights, being equal, all men being created equal. Some key moments was, of course, the Montgomery bus boycott, and that's B-U-S, not B-U-S-S, sit-ins, freedom rides. And freedom rides are when a lot of college students, a lot of white college students to be exact, actually came down to the South to help register African Americans to vote. And they met with a lot of resistance. The Birmingham campaign, Selma, of course, Bloody Sunday is a part of that, where it was basically 3 attempts to get to Montgomery, Alabama, to make it clear that African Americans want the right to vote. The March on Washington, where Martin King gave his "I Have a Dream" speech, all asking for equality before the law. Even though there were laws that are being passed that said that we should not have discrimination, we have the right to vote, we met with resistance in a lot of different ways. The key thing that really kicked off the civil rights movement in the modern era was the overturning of Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson was when an African American who was fair-skinned sat in the front of a train where predominantly white sat. He refused to move to the back. But at that time, the Supreme Court said if you have separate facilities but they're equal, it will be okay. Of course, that was not the case. Brown v. Board of Education says that separate equal is inherently flawed and therefore unconstitutional. And that led to the desegregation of schools that we're celebrating in District 1 this year, 50 years in 2015. Briggs versus Elliott is the actual court case from South Carolina that was a part of that Brown v. Board of Education, because it was actually 5 different students or families throughout the country who had a combined lawsuit to the Supreme Court. And that changed the way we saw education in the country, and we're still addressing those issues today. One reason why we were able to make gains in civil rights because of media. Today we have social media, but TV was the mainstream mode of communication, like radio was in the 1920s. African Americans had fought during World War II, and they saw that they were treated as equal in Europe, and they came back demanding to be treated the same. They wanted equal treatment. They wanted to be fair. They wanted jobs. They wanted the American dream for their families as well, and they gained support. We discussed this and Standard 7.6. There were some laws that were passed through executive order that did away with segregated military for blacks and whites. But when the war ended, many blacks lost their jobs, and that was given to white soldiers who were returning from war. And so we actually had veterans of the World War II who fought bravely were lynched. Truman tried to desegregate the military, and he did, but trying to change someone's hearts was a little bit difficult. And it took a little bit longer to change the culture of America, but it did happen. During the Cold War, because everyone's watching to see what we're doing, and we're saying, hey, we're a place of democracy. Democracy is good. So how does it look for us to have segregated military or segregated washrooms and see the violence that's happening? And because the TV and now we're a global society and they're watching, we could not point a finger without it coming back to us. So Jim Crow was embarrassing to us and to the world, which is why we had some changes that came a little bit quicker. Again, MLK was the main leader, not the only leader. We had people like Stokely Carmichael and Malcolm X, who were also leaders fighting for civil rights. But MLK Jr. is known because he was nonviolent. He was young, and he worked with a lot of different presidents, and he really was influential for the Kennedy administration and Johnson administration. Here's a picture of Stokely Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael was less willing to be nonviolent. He spoke out, but he wanted rights now, and he didn't think we had to cater to, quote unquote, the white man to get that. Malcolm X at first believed for black power, blacks should have their own community, their own businesses, and be separate from the white man. But when he went on a pilgrimage to Mecca, he came back with a more peaceful resolution, and him and MLK actually spoke. The Black Panther Party, the tiger, the Black Panther, of course, is their symbol. And if you see there, this was at, I believe, the 76 games in Munich. You have the Olympians who won in track lift up their fists, speaking for equality. They were actually stripped of their medals for doing that, and then they regained them later. But initially, the Black Panther Party was not violent. They were just asking to take care of their own communities, providing lunch, food, education. But they were seen as more militant than MLK, and so people distrusted them. And then there were some things that were violent in nature. As you see, a lot of different strategies were used in northern cities. We had urban riots, of course, when Bobby Kennedy was killed and MLK was killed. Again, these are a change in leadership and a change in dynamics of how we saw it. If you think about what's happening today, people are less likely or less willing to be nonviolent, but nonviolent approach worked. But when people were not so quick to be more tolerant, we had problems, and it was shown on the TV. Another movement was women's rights movement. Betty Friedman wrote The Feminine Mystique that actually questioned women's role, sexuality, and their role in the economy and business. One key lawsuit or case is Roe v. Wade that said women have the right to privacy in their bodies, which opened the door for women having the right to have an abortion within the first 3 months of their pregnancies. So today we still question whether or not that's right. Christian conservatives were upset, and they are still upset today. Here are pictures of women protesting, say Roe v. Wade. Others, why Roe v. Wade is called a landmark decision. The crosses are symbolizing the deaths of the unborn children. Latinos and Native Americans also fought for equality. If you recall, Native Americans were not even granted citizenship until 1924. Latinos came to this country, were migrant workers. They received very low wages. Their conditions were very poor. And a lot of them were seen as more militant in their approach to try to gain the equality that was due to them. And they mauled themselves out after the Civil Rights Movement by MLK. These are two key court cases that we will discuss later. We're going to be